to our volunteers. Thank you for announcing that. So for some of us in Phoenix, we got off early, dropping off door to door. And then for the lovely folks out in Tucson, thank you to Pablo and Scratching the Plate for the wonderful meal, heard wonderful compliments. Amy, Mindy, and a few volunteers were out there to greet you. So I hope you had a great start to your day, and a huge, huge shout out for everybody who is here today. For some of you, you're, let me see. Nope, we have over 45 attendees today. So we would love to hear from some of you. If you feel very comfortable, no pressure, go ahead and in the chat, go ahead and tell us where you're from. And if you feel comfortable telling us how many years you've been a survivor, we'd love to hear from you. We do have a few Bagot team members here today, so I'm going to throw it over to Amy, who's going to give us some housekeeping issues.
Well, as she said, my name is Amy. I'm a program assistant at Bagot, and I am a 2-time cancer survivor. And it has been 3 years since my second diagnosis. So some of those housekeeping items, please keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. At the very end, we're going to do some Q&A, and if you want to ask live, then you can unmute yourself at that point. There's like a raise hand button that you can use for that. As we've mentioned kind of multiple times to you, we are recording, and it will be on our, it's going live on Facebook, and it will also be on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want your face on there, make sure to turn your camera off. I will be spotlighting Judy when she is speaking, so she should come up on your page as kind of the main thing that you see, and that's what will be recorded. But if you want to change that, at the top right is a little thing that says view, and you can change that to gallery view, and then you'll see kind of other people. But that way, while she's speaking, you get to see her smiling, wonderful face. There is closed captioning available. At the bottom, there's a CC button. I'm just going to let you know that it is kind of a translation that comes through Zoom. So some of it can just be entertaining. So if you're following just that, you might be wondering why we're talking about weird things. And so definitely, if you have volume, keep that up, but you can also turn off those subtitles if they're popping up and you don't want to see those. So whatever works best for you. As I mentioned, there's Q&A at the end, so you can use the raise hand button, you can unmute yourself. But as we all know, as cancer survivors, sometimes you don't remember what your question is going to be by the end. So feel free to type those in the chat as you go through. All three of us will be monitoring that so that we can touch on those at the end of the presentation also. And I'm going to throw it on over to Mindy.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mindy Griffith, the Executive Director of Bagot, and it is so wonderful to have you all join us today. I guess afternoon for some of you. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today and thank Judy for being with us. Judy Pearson is a graduate of Michigan State University and a best-selling author with 4 books and millions of published words to her credit. And she has wonderful words when you're able to listen to her, so you're lucky today. An accomplished presenter and speaker, Judy is the founder of A Second Act, has been featured in the AACR National Cancer Research Progress Report, was named one of Chicago's most inspirational women, a finalist for the Arizona Healthcare Leadership Awards, and named a Phoenix Healthcare Hero. Judy and her husband live up the road from us in Phoenix, Arizona, and we're fortunate to have the pleasure of her joining us today. So thank you, Judy, for being here.
Thank you so much. And missing from my bio is I was also the 1971 National Blueberry Queen. I got to be sure to add that because that's a really important thing. I am thrilled to be here with all of you and very honored that you asked me to join you. And I thought maybe the best way to begin for those of you who don't know me is just to give you a little background of my connection to cancer. I had a clean mammogram in December of 2010, and 2 months later, scratching my cleavage, felt a lump. Now, I had been married for about 6 months at that time, so I asked my new husband to feel it as well, because men will feel your boobs if you ask them to. And he said that it was indeed something new. And after the whirlwind of diagnostics that we've all been through, I was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer. And triple negative is about 15% of breast cancer diagnoses are triple negative, meaning that it was not hormonally fueled. Women of color, young women, and women of Ashkenazi Jewish descent are typically the ones diagnosed with that. And I know I'm not young, and I know I am not a woman of color, and I don't know of any Ashkenazi background. So it was pretty much a shock to have cancer. And then that diagnosis was really weird. So I made a deal with God and the universe that if I survived, I would do something with my survivorship, which sounded very lofty, but you know how it is. You're grasping at straws. I'll do anything. I'll do anything. But what I was, and as a researcher by profession, I went to work researching what my treatment would be, my surgery, my reconstruction. But at no time did it occur to me that survivorship was going to be a thing, that I should actually research survivorship. And when I was hit with all kinds of issues shortly out of treatment, night sweats, insomnia, and chronic fatigue, joint pain, brain fog, I went to my oncologist and said, I don't understand. Why didn't I hear about any of this? And she became, and I tried to ask it nicely, but she became extremely defensive and said, it wasn't important to talk to you about survivorship. We were busy saving your life. So I found a new oncologist and went to work to become as much of an expert as I possibly could about survivorship. And I really realized that we are rarely prepared for it. In fact, when I left the hospital after my mastectomy, I was given a book from the American Cancer Society that talked all about different types of cancers, different types of treatments. In the very back of the book, about 4 paragraphs, was the chapter on survivorship. I don't know how many 100 words it was, a couple hundred words. Writers run by word count. But it seemed to me really odd that if the whole goal is to get past the diagnosis and past the treatment and live our best lives, shouldn't that be the biggest part in any book about cancer? Then I started looking back at some work that I'd been doing before cancer. I am a nonfiction writer. I write biography, and I have to add that in addition to being National Cancer Survivors Day, this is also the 77th anniversary of the D-Day landings on the shores of France that turned the tide for the Allies against the Nazis. And my first 2 books, in fact, were biographies about ordinary people who've been extraordinarily courageous during World War II. One was a woman in France who was the architect of the resistance in central France and only had 1 leg. She was just an amazing woman called Virginia Hall. The other book, which was actually my first book, I'm re-releasing in November. It was about a man who was a prisoner of the Imperial Japanese forces in the Philippines. And this year will also be the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landing, or excuse me, of the Pearl Harbor bombings and the other Pacific War bombing. So anyway, I had been researching before cancer a book about women's courage, the difference between men's and women's courage, and why that was important to know. And ironically, one of the chapters was about volunteering and how women tend to volunteer in very different ways from men. And I came across some really interesting statistics about the health benefits of volunteering, that it doesn't matter what you do, it makes you feel better about you. And at the same time, I started meeting other people, women survivors of all cancers, who were giving back to the greater good. In fact, one of the women that I had interviewed before my cancer, a woman called Chris Dittman, had metastatic ovarian cancer. She was BRCA positive, had breast cancer, and now metastatic ovarian cancer. And in her survivorship, She had started a support group for other metastatic ovarian survivors. She was writing a newsletter. The pre-cancer Judy thought, what is she doing? She should be spending her time cruising or going through her bucket list, or why is she wasting her time doing this? The post-cancer Judy said, I get it. There's healing in helping. When you take the focus off yourself and shine it out to the world in whatever way, your own problems tend to take a back seat. So that book didn't really suit me at the moment. I couldn't find the next great story to tell. So I created a second act, as Mindy said, on the premise that helping is healing. And our annual fundraisers are storytelling events. So I now understood that was my mission. That's what I had been spared to do, I thought. And then I met a Tucson woman called Susie Lay. She is an oncology nurse. She is an amazing woman. And when we met for lunch that first time, she said to me, I'll probably talk your ear off about survivorship. It's been my passion for decades. And I thought, okay. And in turn, I paid her back by asking her thousands and thousands of questions over the next 2 years. And she became the inspiration for my next book, called From Shadows to Life, a biography of the Cancer Survivorship Movement. I think it's really interesting in life to look back over our shoulders at our footprints in the sand. So I'm a writer, I get cancer, I get better, I start second act, I meet Susie, and she's the inspiration for the next book. And I think that's true for any of us. If we look over our shoulders back to maybe even the time before our first diagnoses and start seeing the paths that we've taken, we can make better sense out of the wreckage that is cancer. And I kind of call those nuggets the treasure in the wreckage that's cancer, because it wreaks havoc on our lives. And as I was researching Shadows to Life, it was a combination, digging into history because that's my thing, but it was also amazingly healing for me to understand what all these early survivors began understanding as they marched through their survivorship, that they weren't alone. But that wasn't always the case. Before the 1970s, half of everyone diagnosed, more than half of every diagnosis ended in death. There were no really great treatments. The treatments we had were horribly toxic, and there just wasn't enough money going into research. Ironically, Richard Nixon, at the same time, was looking at a very iffy re-election in 1972. And his aides came to him and said, Mr. President, there's a bill making its way through Congress called the National Cancer Act. Cancer is a bipartisan issue. Wouldn't it be great to have one of those today? It's a bipartisan issue. Democrats get it as much as Republicans. We think if you put your name on this bill, that you could be reelected. So on December 23rd, 1971, 50 years ago this year, President Nixon signed the National Cancer Act. And in the press conference afterwards, he said it could just be the most significant act of his presidency. Then they went down a very slippery slope. He never really said it, but some of his aides said, oh, and we're going to cure it by the bicentennial. So of course, by the bicentennial, cancer wasn't cured. Nixon wasn't president anymore. And it actually was the most significant act of his presidency because it infused $1.3 billion into research. That's $8.4 billion today over that time span until 1976. And all of the things that scientists and researchers were on the cusp of discovering and on the cusp of having approved were approved. We all owe our lives to Richard Nixon, which is really hard to imagine, I realize. But here's the problem. Cancer was thought to be contagious for a very long time. Humankind had learned that all deadly diseases were contagious. So why wouldn't cancer be as well? If you survived, which then became more the norm as time marched on, you couldn't talk about it. You lived in the shadows. You couldn't say that you had fought and won against this deadly disease because people would be terrified of you. I mean, literally, you could be fired. If you had insurance, it could be canceled. College students, childhood cancer survivors couldn't find roommates. You couldn't join the military. You couldn't adopt. You were served on paper plates at cocktail parties because the hostess was afraid your cancer germs would infect her family. In 1986, 35 years ago, the numbers are all stacking up real pretty. 35 years ago, a group of people came together in Albuquerque, and that group included Susie Lay of Tucson. They came together from all over the country. Albuquerque is not a healthcare mecca, as we know. It's a lovely city, but it's not exactly a healthcare mecca. And the fact that that city was chosen and these people came together to Albuquerque spoke volumes about the importance of the topic. There were doctors, there was a lawyer, there were organization founders, including Harold Benjamin, who founded the Wellness Center that went on to become Cancer Support Community. There were cancer survivors, some in those categories, some just random cancer survivors. And they didn't come together to cure cancer. That obviously was something that the world was now recognizing was maybe not going to happen, but it could certainly be better managed. Now, they came to dispel the myths, the myth of contagion, the myth that we were a sickly lot, the myth that you shouldn't bet on someone with cancer because they would waste your time as an employer and your money ultimately. And they founded that weekend in October in Albuquerque what came to be known as the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. One of the founders, Dr. Fitzhugh Mullen, who was a prolific writer, had written, if you can get your hands on a used copy of his book called Vital Signs, he found his cancer tumor in his chest himself. It's an astounding book. And I had the great pleasure of meeting with him several times as I was writing this book. He said, and I'm going to read it so I get it right, and we're all going to wrap our minds around this. He said, it's as if, it's as if we've invented sophisticated techniques to save people from drowning. But once they've been pulled from the water, we leave them on the dock to cough and splutter on their own in the belief that we have done all we can. And that pretty much describes survivorship then, and in many cases, as was mine with my oncologist, survivorship today. You get pulled onto the dock, but in many areas, especially smaller communities, more rural communities, and in many ethnic and socioeconomic communities, you're just left on the dock. So the founders of NCCS said, we're not going to do that. We're going to make a difference. And it was the first time that people came together and felt open and comfortable discussing their survivorship. Susie told me, she was an oncology nurse, and she told me even when she shared her fears of a return of her cancer occurred in 1972. She was the lucky recipient of one of those new treatments, combination chemotherapy, which is pretty usual in these days, but was very new then. She said to me when she would talk to the other nurses and talk to the doctors with whom she was working about her fears of recurrence and maybe some PTSD, they looked at her like she was crazy. She was cured. Why was she worrying about these things? So Fitz told me they just fell into one another's arms that weekend. It was just like, oh my God, you talk just like me. You are just like me. I can't even imagine it. And in addition to founding NCCS, they also launched the survivorship movement. They took a look at the women's movement and the civil rights movement of the 70s and the AIDS movement, which had just occurred and was actually still going on in the mid 80s, and created the survivorship movement, which probably many of you and I hadn't heard of. So this movement and my book and everything that the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship did and does is not about the disease. The disease is well written about, well talked about, well researched. It's the human part of cancer. It's us. It's the survivors who are now hoping to create our best lives. We've been given this second chance for however many days we have left. So one of the first things they did was define survivorship. They define survivorship. It begins at the moment of diagnosis, because that's when we started surviving cancer. And it continues through the balance of our lives, no matter how long that might be. They went after all the discrimination that was happening. Remember the lawyer I told you about? Brilliant woman, Barbara Hoffman. She went to Congress. She testified both in person and in writing. They had assemblies. Imagine, if you can, that there had never been groups of survivors coming together and talking about their survivorship, things that are happening all over the country today. And in fact, the first assembly that they had, a woman called Merrill Hastings stood up at that assembly and said, I'm creating a National Cancer Survivors Day. It's going to be the first Sunday in June every year. Who's with me? That was today. They wrote actually an almanac, the Cancer Survivors Almanac. There had never been a book for cancer survivors, sort of a whole earth catalog where you could go look up treatment issues and psychosocial issues and all the things that we now take for granted. It was revolutionary because of the survivorship movement, because of that intrepid group of people. The Office of Cancer Survivorship was founded in 1995. Again, or excuse me, 1996, 25 years ago, all these cool numbers. And then in 1998, they really did something. They created a march on Washington called The March. They took over the mall, the National Mall, between the reflecting pool, almost to the doorsteps of Congress. And 200,000 people showed up, not just to bring awareness to cancer, like everybody's aware that there's cancer. Their method and their purpose was to create awareness for survivorship. Basically, they were veterans guiding the rookies. That was something that Fitz said over and over and over again is so important for survivors to do. And sometimes it's hard for us as cancer survivors to get our minds and our thoughts off our own problems. And we all have them. It doesn't matter whether, again, they're physical, they're psychosocial, they're financial, they're relational. There are many, many demons that survivors have to deal with. But we are veterans, and it doesn't matter how far out of diagnosis we are. If you're a day out or a decade out, you know more than the men and women who will be diagnosed tomorrow. And if you take some time and share your knowledge with those people, that's the whole helping is healing thing I told you about. That's the veterans guiding the rookies. And that's so important. Doesn't matter how much you know. It doesn't matter what statistics you can spew out. You have experience, and that's the important thing. NCCS continued their work, has continued their work over the decades, giving true meaning to one of my, I love quotes, to one of my favorite quotes by Margaret Mead, who was a cultural anthropologist, ironically, who died of pancreatic cancer in 1978. But she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. That was what NCCS did. And while they began as a grassroots organization, and then their arc blossomed, they moved from Albuquerque to Washington, D.C., because they felt they could better affect all of the discrimination work and all of the research that they were hoping would now be done for survivorship. That was why the Office of Cancer Survivorship was created. Because they became a national organization and no longer a grassroots organization, they paved the way for all the rest of us to create our grassroots organizations. They helped us to come out of the shadows to do our thing. So Bagot and Tucson Cancer Conquerors and A Second Act, my little organization, we're here because of the advocacy work that NCCS did. We are the Cancer Survivorship Movement. We are the ones responsible for picking up the flag and carrying it forward. Advocacy is their cornerstone, and it's up to us. You know how when people say, well, the government should do this and the government should do that. And I always laugh and say, you guys, we are the government. We are the ones that get to go to our Congress people, because no other country has the freedom to do that we do, and say, hey, I want to go a different direction. Same thing is true with the survivorship movement. We can't say they should be doing, we are the survivorship movement. And I'm only going to throw one more little quote at you, because again, I love quotes. And it kind of speaks back to my diagnosis, which was 10 years ago this year. There's an artist, an American artist, who had a friend who had survived the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship sunk by German U-boats at the outset of World War I. And her friend had survivorship guilt. And Mary Cassatt said to her, if you were saved, it is because you have something else to do in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to do that something else in this world. Happy Cancer Survivors Day.
Thank you, Judy. That was fabulous.
Of course.
So appreciate it. You guys, I just want to remind you, you can type any questions in the chat. We're going to do a little Q&A now. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can do that also. I have a question though. How can we help the movement?
So one of the things that NCCS did was, as I said, advocacy was the cornerstone of their organization. And they broke advocacy into three different parts. There's advocacy for ourselves, and that's probably the most important part. It's like the stewardess or the flight attendant tells you to put your mask on first before you can help others. Same thing is true with advocacy. Get your questions answered. Don't be afraid to change physicians if you're uncomfortable. Make sure you're doing everything you can to help yourself. Don't be afraid, and don't ignore health issues. They're probably not big. We're going to go with that because it's probably going to be true, but advocacy for self is super important. The second type is advocacy for others. It's sort of the veterans guiding the rookies thing again. Help somebody who can't help themselves. Take them food, give them books, just sit and talk to them. We all know the different things that we needed and craved while we were going through treatment. Help other people to do the same thing. And then finally, advocacy on a grander scale, whether that's local government, state government, national government, writing articles, sharing blogs, speaking on behalf of survivorship, making sure that the world understands that cancer doesn't end when treatment does, so that people aren't surprised by that concept. Not that life can't be as good. And I'm telling you, I can't even count the number of people who have said that their lives are even richer since cancer. That's something that's a really important fact to share. So that's my 10 cents worth on my soapbox here.
Well, thank you. I do think we have one more question that came up.
Arlene, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Oh, Lisa, did you have another question you wanted to do first?
Nope, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment. I've been at the NCCS political action conference training, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that one of the big things that they are working on is getting Medicare. One of the bills that has been introduced the last a couple of years or so is a bill for Medicare to pay oncologists for them to do a survivorship plan with patients, and that bill is still sitting around in Congress. So anybody who wants to get politically active can contact their senators or congressmen and let them know that it's an important bill, because one, if Medicare gets approved to do that, then two, the second thing that will happen is then other insurance companies will pay for it. And that's part of the problem, I think, with oncologists, is they only have so much time and their billing hours are cut. And it's really an important way to push survivorship plans for all of us. So just my little rah-rah speech.
I love it. I love it.
Lisa, did you have another question?
I was just going to ask Judy, you mentioned your second act. Can you just give us a little bit about that? And then is there something in the future that's coming up that you have on the calendar?
Absolutely. So we're really unique and really have one mission, and that is to support and celebrate women who are women survivors of all cancers, who are using their gifts of life and experience to give back to the greater good. So it's all the things, ironically, all the things that I've been talking about. And I just think that's a really important focus. So many organizations are wonderful at nutrition education and exercise education, and support groups are great. And there's tons of all of those kinds of things. So we tried to come up with a format that is just really, really super, super unique. As with everybody else's programs, COVID took a bite out of us, but hey, we are undeterred. So September 22nd is our return of Girls Night Out here in Phoenix. We'll schedule something shortly after that down in Tucson. Girls Night Out is just a bunch of women survivors, and the boys can come too, coming together and networking. There's typically not a big program, but we also award micro grants every year to Arizona women survivors who are ready to launch or grow second acts. The grant portal opened actually June 1st and it closes July 31st. So I encourage everybody to go to asecondact.org with a 2 second and take a look at that to see if it's something you'd like to apply for. And so at the September Girls Night Out, we'll introduce this year's grant recipients. And then we will have a return of our storytelling performance next March. We don't have a date locked in yet, but it's probably the 13th or the 20th. So more information coming on that.
Awesome. I do have a couple more questions. The first one is, do you plan to do any more writing about cancer in general or about cancer survivorship, to share stories about cancer survivors?
So, Second Act also produces a book that is an ever-evolving collection of the stories of the women who've been parts of our storytelling cast. But my focus, as I said, is I love telling people stories. That's for sure. And this was the first time I had ever written a group biography. I didn't even know that was a thing, but apparently it is. And it was great because I got to, instead of a cradle to grave storytelling book, where someone's story might have trailed off, another story began. But typically I focus on a single individual when I write. And as a result of researching for this book, I do have the next book subject, biography subject selected. And I'm not ready to reveal who that is quite yet, because I want to get a little bit further into the research so I can stake my flag. So stay tuned, but it is cancer related.
Gotcha. All right. And as a non-survivor, how can a non-survivor support someone who's diagnosed with cancer?
Oh man,
that's a tough one.
Yeah. How much time we got?
Yeah.
So there are so many ways, but the first thing I always say to people is that you ask the cancer survivor themselves what they need, because each of us needs something different. Whether it's just to be heard, I just need to vent. When I was going through treatment, as I mentioned, I was a newlywed, and in the wow, how many more things can we pile on Judy category, my son, in the middle of my treatment, deployed to Afghanistan for 6 months. He's an Air Force, he's retired now, Air Force counterintelligence agent. So I had, a ton on my plate, and I just needed to vent, but I didn't want to do it to my sweet husband, because the non-survivor partner always feels helpless and wants to do what they can. And if you complain to them, then they feel more helpless. So sometimes a survivor just needs to vent. Sometimes they want to be distracted. Sometimes I've found a number of cases. I have a very, very dear friend who last summer, while I was writing this manuscript, was going through treatment. And of course, when we started doing this, actually, I was still able to go to her treatments with her. But I started reading my manuscript to her. I read a chapter to her a week. And it was super helpful for me, because I could say, oh, wait, I need to change this, and, catch errors in it. It was terrific for her, because she would crochet while I was doing it. Her is pretty brainless. She doesn't think. And so sometimes just having somebody read to you is a good thing to do. Sometimes it's a pedicure. Sometimes it's going shopping. Sometimes, there's 1,000 things. So the first step is ask what
that's
and then do it.
Move.
Hold on. Sorry, guys. Got a mute here. Got a little bit coming through. Thank you, Judy. Yeah, it really is. It's a difficult question, because they're so, everybody's so different. And of course, you can always send them a bag, which is always a great option to help.
Oh my, I forgot. Yeah,
hey, that's okay. That's what we're here for, right? Because, it's the first thing in our head all the time, but that's what we're working on, is to get that to be the first thing in everybody's head, to help them get organized and all of that. If there are any other questions, if you guys want to raise your hand, unmute yourself, put it in the chat if you want to. If you're not comfortable, or you just still need to think about what it is you want to ask, I am going to post Judy's email in the chat again. She has allowed us to do that so that you can email her questions that you have. I think for me personally, just even reading, even just the first start of your book, reading about all that history, about how it was such a bad thing to even talk about it, and the negativity that surrounded it. When I was diagnosed, I was like putting it out there for everybody, because I'm like, mine was caught early. I want everybody else's to get caught early and get tested and share with everybody. I was writing blogs. I was, but it's amazing. There still is a stigmatism around it, and it's so hard to get around. And I think the more of us that are survivors, the more open we are, it helps take that away.
One of my now favorite resources, it wasn't available when I had written my previous books, is a subscription service called newspapers.com. It's a part of ancestry.com, and it has probably hundreds of thousands of English language newspapers going all the way back to the 1500s. So it's great if you're researching your ancestry, but it's even greater if you're a writer. So in researching this book, I was able to, pick a year, pick a date, and pick a topic, cancer related or related, as I said, to this book. And the articles, we were called victims before the word survivor was actually coined. We were cancer victims, which I don't know about you guys, but I feel less like a victim ever than anybody else. But the way things were in my lifetime, but just earlier, it's astounding to me. It really is. And I think, again, I'm a biographer. I love history. So the whole adage, we study history so that we can learn from it, and so that we don't repeat the bad parts, but we do repeat the good parts, applies here as well. I mean, this is super important history. And I just want to, can I talk about my book conversations? So again, looking for the treasure in the wreckage. So because of COVID, so let me back up. When you're a writer and you have a book release, you go on a book tour. And when you're not a famous writer, like I'm not a famous writer, you pay for your own book tour. So I used to jump on a plane and jet from state to state and stay with family members and friends to cut down on the cost, eat their food, drink their booze. And then during COVID, there was no jetting, and there were no book events, there were no bookstore gatherings. So everybody in the world was Zooming, and I, not the first author to do this, but I thought, well, great, I'm going to do a Zoom book tour. Well, the Zoom book tour has really been fabulous because I've reached people all across the country I otherwise would not have. I even spoke for the for Hodgkin's International, which is a Hodgkin's disease support organization. They had people on the Zoom from the UK. So everyone in England was having their happy hour while we were still all drinking our tea and coffee here in Arizona. And it was fabulous. They don't cost me anything. They don't cost the people involved anything. They're simply Zoom events. So I just want everyone to know I would love to do a Zoom event with everybody on this call, all your friends. Shoot me an email if you're interested. We'll get a date on the calendar and we'll just do it. And it doesn't matter where in the country you are. It's the coolest thing ever. And you don't have to read the book to enjoy the conversation. The point is simply to get this information across, most important of all, that we are the movement. And I have one other plug to make that's not mine, because usually I'm all about the selfless, shameless self-promotions. I have a friend who has a very successful podcast, and he actually was the founder of Stupid Cancer, which is a young adult cancer organization. He just launched a new podcast series that will go through the end of the year called Cancer Mavericks. And if you just look up Cancer Mavericks, my friend's name is Matt Zachary. At the same time that I was putting the finishing touches on my manuscript, he was percolating this idea, and we reconnected just randomly on LinkedIn. And he said, oh my gosh, everyone you've spoken to, these are Cancer Mavericks. These are the pioneers that I need to talk about. So find Cancer Mavericks, listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's really fabulous.
So I'm going to throw out this last question because I think it's a good one to kind of end on here. Where do you hope to see the survivorship movement in the next 50 years?
Well, so I plan to be here to look back at it in 50 years, for starters. Probably my biggest wish is that it continue going forward. Cancer is a disease of the aging. The good news is that the reason there are more cancer survivors is because we catch it earlier, we're better at treating it. And so having more survivors is a good thing, not a bad thing. We're also better at preventing it. So there are fewer diagnoses for environmental reasons, but my hope, absolutely number one, would be that the cancer survivorship movement is still moving. And as I said earlier on, that's me and you and everyone moving it forward in whatever way that is, mostly so that the world doesn't forget that cancer doesn't end when treatment does. That's a good thing, but we need to be mindful of that.
Wow, Judy, thank you so very much. What a great way to spend our morning / afternoon with you. You've been a joy. A reminder, we did put Judy's email and website. You can find her books, the newest one and her past ones on her website. So you can go ahead and look at that. And as far as her email, like she said, you can tell her heart is open. So if you have a question and feel like you'd like to have a further conversation with her, please feel free to do so. So before we leave, we want to have a drawing for some of Judy's books that we have to give away.